You would think women might top that list. No, wasn't even on the list. Second on the list was LGBT. Really? Abortion rights affects gay and trans people more than, breeders? I'm happy for LGBT folks that we now live in an age where they can live their authentic lives openly. And we should always be mindful of respecting and protecting. But someone needs to say it. Not everything's about you. And it's okay to ask questions about something that's very new and involves children. The answer can't always be that anyone from a marginalized community is automatically right, trump card, mic drop, end of discussion. Because we're literally experimenting on children. Maybe that's why Sweden and Finland have stopped giving puberty blockers to kids. Because we just don't know much about the long-term effects. Although common sense should tell you that when you reverse the course of raging hormones, there's going to be problems. We do know it hinders the development of bone density, which is kind of important if you like having a skeleton.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Delta Force Thursday, December the 14th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have military shorts, motivational shorts, Bishop Barron, David Goggins, Delta Force, and the 33 Strategies of War. All that and more when I come back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, military shorts.
At the end of the performance, you couldn't hear a sound. That's how you knew it was good, she recalled many years later. They were called Black Evenings because the windows were blacked out to avoid Nazi detection. She was 15-year-old Etta Van Heemstra Hepburn Rustin, but the world would come to know her as Audrey Hepburn, and she was part of the Dutch resistance during World War II. An uncle had been executed for being part of the resistance, and her brother taken to a German labor camp. Since she spoke fluent English, she took on more daring missions. On one occasion, she had a close encounter with German soldiers when she was spotted in the forest, having just dropped off a British flyer. As they approached her, she quickly picked some wildflowers and presented them to the smitten soldiers, and after checking her papers, they let her go. Every loyal Dutch schoolgirl and boy did their little bit to help during the war, said Audrey years later. Many were much more courageous than I was.
The F-16 Fighting Falcon is a single-engine, multi-role fighter aircraft originally developed by General Dynamics for the United States Air Force. First introduced in 1974, the F-16 has been used in various combat and non-combat operations. Some F-16s have 2 seats, while others have only 1 seat. The 2-seat F-16s are designated as the F-16B and F-16D models. These models are primarily used for training new pilots. The rear seat in the F-16B and F-16D is occupied by an instructor pilot who can guide the student pilot through the various procedures involved in flying the aircraft. The 2-seat F-16 also have some operational capabilities. They can be used for reconnaissance missions, electronic warfare, and as forward air controllers. However, they are not as well suited for combat as the single-seat F-16 due to their reduced maneuverability and payload capacity.
In the early morning hours of June 16, 1943, Captain J. Zemer and his crew, dubbed the Eager Beavers, boarded their B-17 for a solo 1,200-mile photography mission of the Japanese airstrip at Buka in the Solomon Islands. It was considered a suicide mission. While photographing the airfield, they spotted a group of Japanese Zeros taking off. It was unanimous that they continue. Over the next 40 minutes, the B-17 came under unrelenting fire. Though Zemer sustained wounds in both arms and legs, he maneuvered the plane so skillfully that the crew shot down 5 enemy planes and survived the onslaught. Slipping in and out of consciousness, Zemer helped guide the plane to an emergency landing 580 miles away. Zemer was awarded the Medal of Honor, as was his bombardier Joseph Sarnowski, who perished during the attack. The rest of the Beavers were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross.
A Dutch cargo ship listing at a dangerous 45-degree angle issued a distress signal in the violent Norwegian Sea. 8 crew members were rescued while the remaining 4 were trying to prevent it from capsizing, but the rescue took a dramatic turn. The wave rolled the ship aggressively, prompting the last 4 crew members to bail out. The captain, as the last man on board, jumped into the turbulent waves, where he was almost sucked underneath the hull and hit by the propeller. Now, the vessel is unmanned in the raging sea. After 48 hours adrift, the tugboats arrived, but what they found was quite surprising. All the cargo remained intact except for a single fishing boat, which also drifted around with only minor damage. It turns out the last-minute efforts of the 4 crew members saved the ship and cargo. And as for the captain, his selfless choice to prioritize others' safety brought a bit of warmth to the relentless cold sea.
If you're a fan of naval warfare, you've probably heard the terms destroyer and cruiser thrown around. But what exactly is the difference between these 2 types of warships? Let's start with destroyers. These ships are smaller than cruisers, but they're designed to be fast and nimble. They're typically used for anti-submarine warfare and escorting larger ships. Destroyers are armed with a variety of weapons, including torpedoes, guns, and missiles. They can also carry helicopters for reconnaissance and anti-submarine missions. Now let's talk about cruisers. These ships are larger than destroyers and are designed for multiple roles. They can serve as escorts, but they're also capable of conducting independent operations. Cruisers are heavily armed and armored, with a mix of guns and missiles. They're also equipped with advanced radar and sensor systems for detecting and tracking enemy targets. For example, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer has a full load displacement of approximately 9,000 tons, while the Ticonderoga-class cruiser has a full load displacement of approximately 9,800 to 10,500 tons.
What is a Broken Wing Award? A Broken Wing Award is only given to those service members who perform exceptionally during a catastrophic situation. Like on November 20th, 2020, when a Chinook crew in Afghanistan was hauling a housing unit between 2 military bases. All of a sudden, they heard a thunderous bang as the heavy load swung upward and smashed against the side of the helicopter. As the pilot struggled to regain control of the damaged Chinook, the rest of the crew jumped into action to release the load. But there was a problem. After a few moments, the helicopter was still out of control, and the crew realized they had failed to dislodge the structure, which was now stuck to the bottom of the helicopter. A ground crew quickly got to work and managed to cut loose the dangerous load, but by that time the back rotor had been catastrophically damaged, something that was not fully realized until it slapped against the airframe. Nevertheless, the crew managed to land safely, earning them the Broken Wing Award in recognition of their outstanding airmanship. Flying at 65,000 feet, the last thing the U-2 pilot was expecting to see was a French Mirage climbing out of the clouds to intercept him. At that time, the U-2 was unmatched when it came to aerial reconnaissance, reaching altitudes of over 70,000 feet. When it was first introduced in the mid-1950s, it could fly beyond the range of enemy radar, not to mention Soviet fighters. But when this U-2 crossed into French territory en route to monitor one of the country's nuclear facilities, a Mirage 3 was scrambled to intercept the high-flying intruder. The problem was, Mirages normally couldn't come close to 65,000 feet, meaning intercepting the U-2 should have been impossible. But this Mirage was equipped with rocket boosters, allowing the pilot to climb right up under the U-2's nose, where it nearly collided with the American plane, no doubt startling the U-2 pilot. U.S. officials must have been startled as well. They wouldn't resume overflights to France until years later when they returned with the SR-71 Blackbird.
Why did the U.S. Air Force buy 1,700 PlayStations but not to play games? Back in 2010, the U.S. Air Force Laboratory needed a supercomputer to power radar enhancement, satellite imagery processing, and AI research. The essential components for such a powerful machine came with a big price tag of roughly $10,000 per unit. However, they came up with an idea to use something else. A new piece of tech that was selling at only $400 per unit. And it wasn't a high-end supercomputer, it was the PlayStation 3. But they weren't sure if it was going to work. What gave them the idea was the PlayStation 3's graphics capabilities at the time. Not only was it a lot more affordable, but it also used a fraction of the power compared to a supercomputer. After combining all the PlayStations, they made the Condor cluster, a cluster of 1,760 PlayStation 3s, ready to tackle the most demanding tasks. Now we know where all the PS5s actually went.
He was just a month shy of his 20th birthday and flying his 31st combat mission on August 18, 1945. His B-32 Dominator was patrolling the skies over Tokyo, which had gone eerily quiet since the ceasefire was agreed upon 3 days earlier between the United States and Imperial Japan. He was Army Sergeant Anthony Marchioni, and he was an aerial photographer for the 20th Combat Reconnaissance Squadron. The bomber crew was surprised to see a lone Japanese plane scrambling in their direction, and even more surprised when machine gun fire tore through the thin metal skin of the plane. "I'm hit," Marchioni cried out as he was left with a gaping abdomen wound. Navigator and best friend, Second Lieutenant Kurt Rupke, jumped to his aid. "Stay with me," were Marchioni's last words, cradled in his buddy's arms. Anthony Marchioni passed away while 10,000 feet above Tokyo, becoming the last American death of World War II.
The close-in weapon systems are primarily designed to provide short-range defense against threats such as missiles, aircraft, and other projectiles. It is intended to be the last line of defense against anti-ship missiles. Due to its design criteria, its effective range is very short relative to the range of modern air-to-surface missiles from 1 to 5 nautical miles. It is particularly effective against subsonic anti-ship missiles like Harpoon and Exocet, unless it is a saturation attack. It is unlikely to be successful against hypersonic cruise missiles like the Russian Zircon, because the time required for the Phalanx fire control radar to receive, track, and fire the approaching missile is very short, potentially less than 7 seconds before impact. For hypersonic missiles, a rolling airframe missile, RIM 116, may engage the oncoming missile from a much greater distance.
And that was the military shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a new feature, motivational shorts.
To all you people all over the world, wherever you are, I've read someone, I can't remember whether it was in the Old Testament or I think it was a shaman. There was a drought. Cattle were dying, people were dying in a desert. And the shaman said, build the ditches for the rain. And they said, there is no rain. Dig the ditches and the rain will come. Now you non-believers may say, oh, that's nonsense. Well, believe what you want. That's the rational mind. I don't think the rational mind is working too well at the moment. It's the irrational mind, the subconscious. So what we can do is drag the time into the present, now. Build the ditches. Whatever you want to do, believe it, even if you don't believe. Play the game of belief. Act as if you believe. That is power. That is sheer power.
I want you to focus on me right now. I want you to focus on me right now. There have been a lot of setbacks. There has been a lot of betrayals. There have been lies told. There has been pain inflicted. There's been times you've been handcuffed. There's been times you've been tried. There's been times you've been in situations where you were locked up and you couldn't get out. In spite of all of that, what God spoke to you shall surely come to pass. You weren't ready for it when you saw it. You had to go through more things to grow into it. But you're coming into a season now that things you saw a long time ago are going to come to pass. And it's going to be the kind of joy that brings you to tears.
Everybody has a turn back moment. You have a moment where you could go forward or you can give up. But the thing you have to keep in mind before you give up is that if you give up, the guarantee is it will never happen. That's the guarantee of quitting, that it will never happen no way under the sun. The only way the possibility remains that it can happen is if you never give up no matter what.
Be a dangerous man. You can't be a good man, a fully good man, if you're not a dangerous man. It's okay, be dangerous. Now, being dangerous is not being a threat. They're two different things. To be good is to do good to people, and sometimes doing good to people is protecting those people. Often the most dangerous man in the room is the quietest man in the room. All right? And it's not about going out and lifting weights and getting a bunch of tattoos and wearing leather jackets and walking around with your chest and shoulders up, hulking around saying, I'm dangerous. That's very rarely is that a dangerous man. Become a good man.
Starting tomorrow, what are you going to do that'll make a change in your life's direction? Good question. What are you going to do starting tomorrow that'll make a difference? Now, see, if you don't do something starting tomorrow that'll make a difference, guess what? It's going to be the same. And see, that way you can guess what the next 5 years are going to be like. Look at the last 5. Because the next 5 are going to be like the last 5 unless you, major key, tomorrow, change it all. Or change a little, or change something, or don't change. It's choice time. You can do whatever you want. But it's nice to know any day you wish you can change your whole life.
And that was the motivational shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, a little bit of Bishop Robert Barron.
Do a little thought experiment. Imagine now you're having a conversation with a friend, and you're just following the rhythm of the conversation. You're just together exploring the truth, following where it leads. You're not preoccupied with yourself or the impression you're making or what he thinks of you. How wonderful, how exuberant that experience is. It's as though the conversation is playing you. Now, contrast that to you're having a conversation, but you're desperately interested in how you're appearing and what he thinks of you. And are you making the right impression? What's happened there is you're not lost in the beauty and rhythm of the conversation. You're not given over to the truth. You're turned in awkwardly and anxiously upon yourself. That's pride. It's like a monkey on your back. You're going through your whole life, and all you're worried about is the impression you're making, what they think of you, and it divorces you from reality. When you're lost in that conversation, you're into reality. The prideful person is locked in a little prison.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now David Goggins.
Most people live their whole lives without ever contemplating what it means to be great. To them, greatness looks like Steve Curry, Rafael Nadal, Toni Morrison, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, or Amelia Earhart. They put all the greats on a pedestal, but think of themselves as mere mortals. And that's exactly why greatness eludes them. They turn it into some untouchable plane, impossible for almost anybody to reach, and it never even crosses their mind to aim for it. No matter what I'm doing or which arena I'm engaging in, I will always aim for greatness because I know that we are all mere mortals and greatness is possible for anyone and everyone if they are willing to seek it out in their own soul. In Goggins terms, greatness is a state of letting go of all your faults and imperfections, scavenging every last bit of strength and energy, and putting it to use to excel at whatever you set your mind to. Even if some motherfucker out there told you it was impossible, it is a feeling pursued by those rare souls willing to extend themselves beyond reason and pay the cost. In the late 1950s, Captain Joseph Kittinger was a pilot in the Air Force, tapped for experimental aviation and skydiving duty in New Mexico. He wasn't a household name. In fact, hardly anybody knew the first thing about him until August 16, 1960, when he donned a red duct tape pressure suit and boarded an open-sided gondola tethered to an onion-shaped helium balloon. He flew that rig nearly 20 miles high until he reached the thin atmospheric line where everything goes from blue to black. He traveled to a place where the horizon did not exist. He was above and beyond all previously known limitations. Suspended at 102,800 feet, he unclipped his harness and stepped into space. His free fall lasted nearly 5 minutes. His maximum velocity was 614 miles per hour. He plummeted over 80,000 vertical feet before his primary chute opened. This was no Red Bull sponsored party. It wasn't a television show. Kittinger wasn't an entertainer. He was an explorer, a seeker of a new realm for the world. His flight and his jump helped make man's space flight possible. And also for himself. I don't jump to Earth from outer space, but I know that atmospheric line between blue and black. It is the glimmer of greatness that runs right through the human soul. We all have it. Most of us will never see it because to get there requires a willingness to extend yourself to the limit without any guarantee of success. Then again, success is just another mile marker on the journey. Landing the jump and walking away while lighting a cigarette as if it were a typical day on the job made Kittinger look cool. But it didn't make him great. His willingness to do it in the first place, knowing that the chances of failure were high and everything it cost him, made him great. It wasn't a stunt to garner fame or publicity. It was merely an attempt to see what was humanly possible. Just as words can be redefined, never doubt that we can redefine ourselves. It can feel impossible at times because we live in a world filled with arbitrary boundaries and fixed social lines that are as thick as the walls around a fortress. Worse, we allow those walls to limit us in too many ways. The brainwashing starts early, and it starts at home. The people we grow up with and the environments we grow up in define who we think we are and what we think life is all about. When you're young, you can only know what you see. And if all you are ever exposed to are lazy people content with mediocrity or who convince you of your own worthlessness, greatness will remain a fantasy. If you live in the ghetto or in a dying industrial or farming town where buildings are boarded up, addiction runs rampant, and the schools are a mess, that will factor into the possibilities others envision for you and you envision for yourself. But even privileged people can feel shackled by their circumstances. The vast majority of parents don't know what greatness looks like, so they are ill-equipped and afraid to encourage big dreams. They want their children to have security and don't want them to experience failure. That's how limited horizons get passed down from generation to generation. Should we really be surprised that almost everybody has a knack for twisting their story to work against themselves? I hear it all the time. Privileged kids say, I have too much, so I cannot develop the skills that you have. The kid that came from nothing will tell me, I don't have enough. Therefore, I cannot develop the skills that you have. No matter where someone is in life, they never fail to confess why they can't get where they need to go. The minute they open their mouths, I see how limited their horizons are. and their sob stories come with the expectation that I will deliver a become great package to their front door. But that's not how it works. To this day, it is for me to become better mentally. How I look has just become I have thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles on this body. Running, pull-ups, push-ups, swimming, whatever you want to call it. This body is what it is now. It's from repetition. It's not from studying, hey, if you hold a plank for this long, go that book. I don't care about it. I just do it for my mind.
Right.
I want to continue to harden because that's the only thing I want. That's what I want. I want to have that mind ready for life. If I had to choose one pervasive mentality in today's culture that I would deem the most dangerous, I would select the victim mentality. Playing the role of the victim means pointing the finger at someone or something outside yourself for things that are going wrong in your own life. This has to do with something called your locus of control. Someone who has an internal locus of control believes that he or she can influence events and their outcomes. But someone with an external locus of control blames outside forces, other people, circumstances, or even fate for everything. Everywhere I look in today's society, it seems that more and more people have an external locus of control. For example, if someone is having trouble getting a job and they blame it on the current political or economic landscape, they are demonstrating an external locus of control. Or if they often catch colds and blame them on their coworkers or germ-riddled work environment, that's an external locus of control mindset. Another one is when someone is constantly in debt and they blame inflation or the high cost of living rather than taking responsibility for their own financial planning and budgeting. If someone goes through a divorce or a bad breakup and is still in pain 5 years later and blaming it on the ex, that's an external locus of control. Essentially, we are choosing to have an external locus of control anytime that we are pointing the finger away from ourselves for anything going on in our life. Here's the problem with this kind of thinking. It takes away your power. By playing the blame game, you're effectively throwing up your hands and saying, well, I'm a victim and there's not a damn thing I can do about it. The moment you blame someone else for something you're feeling or experiencing is the moment that you give up your power. By giving your power away, you are making a decision to effectively let life happen to you. You are refusing to take responsibility for your own life. As you might imagine, that can be a very destructive pattern to set. In order to stay connected with our best self, we need to always take responsibility for what happens in our life. We need to find a way to have control, even in moments where it just seems like the world is out to get us. Sure, bad things happen that are outside of our control. But here's the key. We are 100% in control of our reactions to those things. We can choose to spiral into depression, anxiety, anger, resentment, or frustration and just pull the covers back over our head. Or we can choose to react in a way that benefits us and those around us. If we fail a test, we can analyze what went wrong and study in a more effective way before taking it again. If we keep catching a cold, we can learn about how to boost our immunity and overall health. The list goes on and on. But the bottom line is that we have a choice. Blame someone or something else that we can't control, or find a way we can take responsibility and change what we're doing so we can change the outcome. You have to remind yourself, we all have a story. All of us have gone through very hard times. But when we're in a hard time, our mind has a way of forgetting what all we've overcome. I have a way of taking 1 second when I want to quit and saying, okay, you endured this. So I look at my life and how I came up as the ultimate training ground versus most people look at it as why? Woe is me. God, why?
Right, exactly.
Why? I had to flip this upside down and say, hang on a second. God was training me to be one of the baddest men on the planet Earth. That's how this was my journey. Because Those things beat me, but they didn't kill me. And I was able to work around them and figure out ways through it. So when I was in the worst time of my life in Hell Week, I looked at everybody and said, I'm the most trained person here. I've gone through more mental torture than any of you all can even fathom. So I'm looking at the baddest people on the planet. I'm looking at them like this. You guys can't hold a stick. So I started looking at verses like, I don't belong here, versus like, I might be the baddest person to ever come here. Who could have pulled this off? Who could have been given a sewer to live in their mind and say, okay, at birth, I'm going to put you in the worst place on the planet Earth, and let me see if you can go to the top of the mountain with nothing, but just hard work, grit, and figuring it out, and not putting yourself back in the dungeon every time something got hard. So that's what became my daily voice was, you really are the baddest person on the planet.
Identity is a trap that will keep you in blinders if you let it. Sometimes identity is what we are saddled with by society. Other times it's a category we claim. It can be empowering to associate yourself with a particular culture, group, job, or lifestyle. But it can also be limiting. If you stick with your own too closely, you will be susceptible to groupthink, and you may never learn who you really are or what you can accomplish. I know people who are so obsessed with landing a specific job that once they settled into that role, they clipped their own wings. They never moved on or attempted to try anything new, and that blocked them from evolving and developing new skills. Sometimes we are misled by others who categorize us based on what they perceive as our identity. When I met with Navy recruiters, several tried to steer me away from SEAL training and into a different opportunity because I didn't fit the mold. I was overweight, my ASVAB scores were low, and there was my skin color. Remember, I was only the 36th Black Navy SEAL. The recruiters weren't trying to hurt me, and I don't believe they were racist. They honestly thought they were helping me by presenting more realistic options. Usually, however, we mislead ourselves. Those of us who are struggling with our self-worth, like I was as a child, often build identities around the very things that haunt us the most. Not because we want to, but because subconsciously we are convinced that is how everyone else sees us. You cannot allow what someone else may or may not think about you or the issues you're dealing with to stop your progress. My environment and my history made me over-anxious and stressed out. The color of my skin made me a mark. I was prejudged and vulnerable at almost every turn, and it was my job to defy all of that. No matter how troubled or hopeless or sheltered your environment is, it is your job, your obligation, your duty, and your responsibility to yourself to find the blue to black line, that glimmer buried in your soul, and seek greatness. Nobody can show you that glimmer. You must do the work to discover it on your own. There are no prerequisites to becoming great. You could be raised by a pack of wolves. You could be homeless and illiterate at 30 years old and graduate from Harvard at 40. You could be one of the most accomplished mothers in the country and still be hungrier and work harder than everybody else you know as you attempt to conquer a new field. And it all starts with a commitment to looking beyond your known world, beyond your street, town, state, or nationality, beyond culture and identity. Only then can true self-exploration begin. After that comes the real work. Fighting those demons every morning and all day long is maddening because they only ever want to break you down. They don't encourage you or make you feel good about yourself or your long odds as you fight through all the toxic mold and crust that is self-hate, doubt, and loneliness. They want to limit you. They want you to surrender and retreat back to what you know. They want you to quit before you get to pliability, where the sacrifice, hard work, and isolation that felt so heavy for so long become your haven, where after struggling to visualize greatness for years, it is effortless.
And that was David Goggins. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 Strategies of War, second part of Chapter 3.
But place any of us in an adverse situation, and our rationality vanishes. We react to pressure by growing fearful, impatient, confused. Such moments reveal us for the emotional creatures we are. Under attack, whether by a known enemy or unpredictably by a colleague, our response is dominated by feelings of anger, sadness, betrayal. Only with great effort can we reason our way through these periods and respond rationally. And our rationality rarely lasts past the next attack. Understand, your mind is weaker than your emotions. But you become aware of this weakness only in moments of adversity, precisely the time when you need strength. What best equips you to cope with the heat of battle is neither more knowledge nor more intellect. What makes your mind stronger and more able to control your emotions is internal discipline and toughness. No one can teach you this skill. You cannot learn it by reading about it. Like any discipline, it can come only through practice, experience, even a little suffering. The first step in building up presence of mind is to see the need for it, to want it badly enough to be willing to work for it. Historical figures who stand out for their presence of mind, Alexander the Great, Ulysses S. Grant, Winston Churchill, acquired it through adversity, through trial and error. They were in positions of responsibility in which they had to develop this quality or sink. Although these men may have been blessed with an unusual amount of personal fortitude, they had to work hard to strengthen this into presence of mind. The ideas that follow are based on their experience and hard-won victories. Think of these ideas as exercises, ways to toughen your mind, each a kind of counterbalance to emotion's overpowering pull. Expose yourself to conflict. George S. Patton came from one of America's most distinguished military families. His ancestors included generals and colonels who had fought and died in the American Revolution and the Civil War. Raised on stories of their heroism, he followed in their footsteps and chose a career in the military. But Patton was also a sensitive young man, and he had one deep fear, that in battle he would turn coward and disgrace the family name. Patton had his first real taste of battle in 1918 at the age of 32 during the Allied offensive on the Argonne during World War I. He commanded a tank division. At one point during the battle, Patton managed to lead some American infantrymen to a position on a hilltop overlooking a key strategic town, but German fire forced them to take cover. Soon it became clear that they were trapped. If they retreated, they would come under fire from positions on the sides of the hill. If they advanced, they would run right into a battery of German machine guns. If they were all to die, as it seemed to Patton, better to die advancing. At the moment he was to lead the troops in the charge, however, Patton was stricken by intense fear. His body trembled, and his legs turned to jelly. In a confirmation of his deepest fears, he had lost his nerve. At that instant, looking into the clouds beyond the German batteries, Patton had a vision. He saw his illustrious military ancestors, all in their uniforms, staring sternly down at him. They seemed to be inviting him to join their company, the company of dead war heroes. Paradoxically, the sight of these men had a calming effect on the young Patton. Calling for volunteers to follow him, he yelled, "It is time for another Patton to die." The strength had returned to his legs. He stood up and charged toward the German guns. Seconds later, he fell, hit in the thigh. But he survived the battle. From that moment on, even after he became a general, Patton made a point of visiting the front lines, exposing himself needlessly to danger. He tested himself again and again. His vision of his ancestors remained a constant stimulus, a challenge to his honor. Each time it became easier to face down his fears. It seemed to his fellow generals and to his own men that no one had more presence of mind than Patton. They did not know how much of his strength was an effort of will. The story of Patton teaches us two things. First, it is better to confront your fears, let them come to the surface, than to ignore them or tamp them down. Fear is the most destructive emotion for presence of mind, but it thrives on the unknown, which lets our imaginations run wild. By deliberately putting yourself in situations where you have to face fear, you familiarize yourself with it, and your anxiety grows less acute. The sensation of overcoming a deep-rooted fear, in turn, gives you confidence and presence of mind. The more conflicts and difficult situations you put yourself through, the more battle-tested your mind will be. Second, Patton's experience demonstrates the motivating power of a sense of honor and dignity. In giving in to fear, in losing your presence of mind, you disgrace not only yourself, your self-image, and your reputation, but your company, your family, your group. You bring down the communal spirit. Being a leader of even the smallest group gives you something to live up to. People are watching you, judging you, depending on you. To lose your composure would make it hard for you to live with yourself. Be self-reliant. There is nothing worse than feeling dependent on other people. Dependency makes you vulnerable to all kinds of emotions, betrayal, disappointment, frustration, that play havoc with your mental balance. Early in the American Civil War, General Ulysses S. Grant, eventual commander-in-chief of the Northern armies, felt his authority slipping. His subordinates would pass along inaccurate information on the terrain he was marching through. His captains would fail to follow through on his orders. His generals were criticizing his plans. Grant was stoical by nature, but his diminished control over his troops led to a diminished control over himself and drove him to drink. Grant had learned his lesson by the time of the Vicksburg campaign in 1862-63. He rode the terrain himself, studying it firsthand. He reviewed intelligence reports himself. He honed the precision of his orders, making it harder for his captains to flout them. And once he had made a decision, he would ignore his fellow generals' doubts and trust his convictions. To get things done, he came to rely on himself. His feelings of helplessness dissolved, and with them all of the attendant emotions that had ruined his presence of mind. Being self-reliant is critical. To make yourself less dependent on others and so-called experts, you need to expand your repertoire of skills, and you need to feel more confident in your own judgment. Understand, we tend to overestimate other people's abilities. After all, they're trying hard to make it look as if they knew what they were doing, and we tend to underestimate our own. You must compensate for this by trusting yourself more and others less. It is important to remember, though, that being self-reliant does not mean burdening yourself with petty details. You must be able to distinguish between small matters that are best left to others and larger issues that require your attention and care. Suffer fools gladly. John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, is one of history's most successful generals. A genius of tactics and strategy, he had tremendous presence of mind. In the early 18th century, Churchill was often the leader of an alliance of English, Dutch, and German armies against the mighty forces of France. His fellow generals were timid, indecisive, narrow-minded men. They balked at the Duke's bold plans, saw dangers everywhere, were discouraged at the slightest setback, and promoted their own country's interests at the expense of the alliance. They had no vision, no patience. They were fools. The Duke, an experienced and subtle courtier, never confronted his colleagues directly. He did not force his opinions on them. Instead, he treated them like children, indulging them in their fears while cutting them out of his plans. Occasionally, he threw them a bone, doing some minor thing they had suggested, or pretending to worry about a danger they had imagined. But he never let himself get angry or frustrated. That would have ruined his presence of mind, undermining his ability to lead the campaign. He forced himself to stay patient and cheerful. He knew how to suffer fools gladly.
And that was the second part of Chapter 3, Amidst the Turmoil of Events, from the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, inside Delta Force, and the crew, the cell, is now going to go on one last mission before they graduate.
He picked up the telephone book. I'll get on the phone and find us one as soon as business hours open. If we can be off the ground by 10 o'clock, we should have plenty of time to make it to Hamlet before 4 o'clock. I looked at my teammate with admiration. That's perfect, John. A great idea. While you're arranging it, Pete and I will get the cars turned in and get us checked out of here. Sounds good to me, said Pete. But first, let's go to breakfast. I'm starving. That, too, was a good idea. I love flying when I can see something outside, but in those days, I wasn't wild about landing. I was far more accustomed to coming back to Earth by parachute. In the Ranger Battalion, I had gone for as much as 18 months at a stretch without landing in an airplane I went up in. It had gotten to the point that I just didn't trust any reunion with Mother Earth that I wasn't in control of myself. John was a good pilot, our trip was uneventful, and the landing was smooth as silk. We said goodbye to the ferry pilot and ambled over to the main hangar and FBO, fixed base operator, to see about arranging transportation into town. An airport courtesy car was available for our use, but since it was a little over an hour until our pickup time, we elected to have lunch and hang out at the airport before heading into town. Pete struck up a conversation with a young guy who seemed to be the airfield handyman, and he gladly agreed to drive us to the train station. We arrived at the station with about 10 minutes to spare. Just a few seconds past 4 o'clock, a white van with the appropriate markings pulled to the front of the station and came to a halt. The driver pulled his sunglasses down on the tip of his nose, looked at us over the tops of the lenses, and then pushed the glasses back up and adjusted the outside mirror. That was the safe signal. We put our baggage in the back and climbed in. Our instructions had said that the driver would not speak to us, nor were we to speak to him, and it wasn't hard to do. I've never met such a quiet person. It was like the invisible man was driving the vehicle. We drove down Highway 74 and through the small town of Laurinburg, North Carolina. A few miles outside of town, we turned onto a narrow gravel road that carried us a couple of 100 meters off the highway to a large building that looked like an abandoned trucking company terminal or warehouse. I looked over at the driver as we came to a halt. He returned my look and then very deliberately pointed to a door on the side of the building. I turned to tell my mates to wait in the van while I checked out the building, but the driver motioned for us all to dismount. Screw that, I thought, and told the guys not to let the van leave until I got back. I got out and tried the door. It was locked. Before I could knock, someone inside threw it open. It was Jerry Knox. "Come on, Eric, get your guys and come inside. The driver has a tight schedule to keep." I waved to Pete and John and motioned them to hop out. Jerry held the door as we grabbed our stuff and went inside. He then led us down a short corridor, past a few small office cubicles, through another door, and into a large open area the size of a small aircraft hangar. The place was hopping. Trucks were lined up along one wall of the building. Nearby, all of our individual and team equipment was arranged in rows. In the far corner of the bay, an operations center was in place. Guys from the signal section had radios set up, and wires ran out the high windows to the antennas outside. Jerry sent us over to Ron Kardowski for a quick briefing. Ron told us that as part of the play for the culmination exercise, we were responding to an aircraft hijacking. Our OTC class would form the assault troop and field a couple of sniper teams. Ron would be the troop sergeant, and Jim Day would be the troop commander. Jim Bush was in charge of the snipers and would run the TOC. The plane, a Boeing 727, was on the ground now at the Laurinburg-Maxton Airport, which for the purposes of the exercise was to be considered in a somewhat friendly but very backward and corrupt foreign nation. Jim Day and a couple of snipers were at the airport now, working with the local authorities and trying to sort out a lot of conflicting and confusing information. Ron told us to check the TOC status board for our team assignments and then move our equipment into the respective team areas we would find laid out on the floor in chalk. I moved over to the board for a look at our organization and found my slot. Assault Troop, C Team. Team Leader, Haney. Assistant Team Leader, Masters. Benavides, Vandervoort. C Team. That meant that in an assault we would enter over the plane's wings through an emergency exit and move aft. It also meant we would probably form half of the emergency assault team in case things went suddenly bad and we didn't have time to mount a deliberate assault. But if it came to that point, it would only be an attempt to make the best of a bad situation and salvage something from the erupting disaster. Emergency assaults are executed only when terrorists start killing hostages. This was the first of what would become full-blown hijacked aircraft exercises. During my many years' service in 1st SFODD, I would respond to a couple of dozen actual hijackings and almost the same number of aircraft exercises. But whether it was a real situation or training, we went at it with the same intensity and sense of urgency. But the training operations were always the more difficult of the two, and that was true of all our training. About half of the OTC class was already here, so Pete and I found our gear and moved it to our designated team area. Neither Andre nor Jimmy was in yet, so we grabbed their equipment and brought it over too. Then we went to take a look at the information board at the TOC. Not much there yet, just some generalizations about the flight, the estimated number of passengers, and some vague information about how many terrorists may be aboard. We went back to our team area and got out of the way of the guys at the TOC. By nightfall, almost everyone was in. We grabbed Jimmy and Andre as soon as they arrived and brought them up to date, which didn't take long because we had so little information. We grabbed ourselves a case of sea rations and stepped out on the loading dock at the back of the building to heat up some supper and compare notes on our experiences over the last few days. Before long, I got a call to report to the TOC for a team leaders meeting. Ron had the floor. We're having difficulties with the local authorities, which is why we haven't moved to the airfield yet, but we've been able to deploy 2 observation teams around the plane, and we're going to send 2 emergency assault teams forward just in case things decide to go bad. Eric and JT, your teams will initially comprise the emergency assault. I'll rotate the other teams through that position when we're able to move forward. As soon as we break up here, get everything you need to conduct an assault, and also what you'll need to live on for 3 or 4 days. Load the stuff in the gray and blue vans and get ready to move to the airport. Don't worry about drivers. I'll provide them. Be ready to move out in 10 minutes. Ron then shifted his attention to the rest of the group. As for the rest of you, consult the info board. I'll set up a schedule so that everyone will get a chance to work a rotating shift in the TOC. We're going to do our best to get everyone forward under one pretext or the other to at least have a look at the airfield and where the plane is situated. There's one final thing. Ron lowered his voice to a conspiratorial level as he continued. Jim Day really has his hands full, and he needs everybody's help. This exercise alone is a son of a bitch, but whether you know it or not, Jim isn't exactly one of Colonel Beckwith's favorites. If we don't pull this off and do a good job of it, the old man may well use it as an excuse to bounce Jim out of here. Officer business is an area I don't generally concern myself with. No NCO does. But Jim Day is one of the best young officers I've ever served with, and I'd like to keep serving with him. I think you all might agree with me when I say that he's a rare breed. He's worth protecting, and we can do that best by making sure he shines. Pass the word to be extra sharp and give Jim every assistance we can, but don't let the other officers know what's going on. They're good guys too, but they're not under the gun right now. Okay, that's it. You can get back to your teams. JT, Eric, let me know when you're ready to take off. So that explains why Jim Day was made commander of the exercise, I thought, even though he isn't the ranking captain in the class. Old Charlie's putting him under the microscope and having a real close look at him. Well, that isn't necessarily bad. But I agreed with Ron. Jim was a good man, and I wanted to continue working with him. In reality, there was never any danger he would receive less than everyone's utmost and enthusiastic support. That's just the way we operate. JT and I had a quick huddle before we loaded on the vans for the trip to the airport. We had a couple of things to coordinate in case we got a call en route to immediately execute an emergency assault. We agreed that JT's team would enter over the right wing and clear aft, and that my team would enter over the left wing and clear forward. We would run the vans right up to the sides of the airplane and throw the ladders into place, and both teams would mount and enter the plane simultaneously. Speed would have to replace stealth. Once the plane was cleared of terrorists, we would pop all the emergency slides and send the passengers out through every exit. In the event of a fire or an explosion on board, we would open whatever doors we could reach and send people out through those. Within my team, our order of entry into the plane went like this. The short guys would enter first, Jimmy followed by Andre, and clear down the aisle all the way to the cockpit. I would come in third, and Pete would follow me. Since Pete and I were taller than Jimmy and Andre, we would be able to shoot over their heads as they cleared the aisle. Once they hit the forward bulkhead of the cabin, Pete and I would spring forward and clear the cockpit and forward lavatory. The whole thing sounds tricky, but we knew we could get into the plane and clear our sector with a speed that looked like stomping toothpaste from a tube. Controlled mayhem would enter that plane from the middle and sweep in opposite directions. We loaded the vans. I got a radio check with the TOC, gave Ron the high sign, and we were away. When we arrived at the airfield, we made contact with Jim Day and found a place to set up that was out of sight but still gave direct access to the taxiway leading to the plane. We never executed an emergency assault, but the preparation for one was always part of the choreography of Delta Force's response to an aircraft hijacking. A few hours later, our whole group moved to the airfield, and we rotated the duty of the emergency assault teams. For the next 72 hours, we were put through the ringer. During a hijacking response, one of the things our side does is wage a war of fatigue against the hostage takers. The objective is to wear them down mentally, physically, and emotionally. The job of the negotiator is to make sure everything has a price. If the terrorists want water, they have to give something in exchange. If they want the toilets pumped out, they have to give something in return. With every communication, the effort is made to throw the terrorists off their plan and loosen their hold on the initiative. If they can't be induced to give up, we want them to be at their lowest possible state when an assault is mounted. We want them to be tired, frazzled, and drained of confidence. But during this exercise, we were the ones being pushed to the edge. Deadlines for demands would approach. Tension would build. We would stand to and get into assault position, only to stand down and pull back. Then, while we were trying to get some rest, some kind of an emergency would come up, and we'd stand to once again. This seemed to happen every few hours. Jim and Ron had their hands full dealing with the local authorities and representatives from the American Embassy. The ambassador demanded to be informed of every development in the situation, but instructions came from the National Command Authority in Washington to exclude him. The CIA Chief of Station, COS, showed up and said that all operational plans had to meet his approval. He was rebuffed and went away mumbling threats. The National Minister of Internal Security demanded that our sniper observers be pulled in. The U.S. Embassy refused to intervene because the ambassador was miffed at being excluded from the information chain. We suspected that the COS had instigated the security minister's demand. Problem after problem arose and had to be dealt with. The demands were draining to all of us, but particularly so with Jim and Ron. During the second day of the ordeal, we grabbed Jim and Ron one at a time, took them to a hidden spot, and made them lie down and rest for a few hours. During those times, we team leaders rotated command duties and took the heat from all the competing interests. We built a psychic shell around our unit, adhered to our operational plan, and fought off the worst of the intrusions. Twice during the second night, we prepared to conduct an assault. The first time, we were in approach formation within 25 meters of the plane when we were called back. The second time, we were actually on the plane with our hands on the doors, ready to start the countdown when we were recalled. That one took a lot of energy out of us, emotionally and tactically. It's a lot more difficult to back down from a target without detection than it is to make the approach in the first place. And every time we pulled back, we had to leave 2 teams in overwatch in case we were detected and had to launch an emergency assault. But every difficulty we faced, every problem that surfaced during the course of these exercises showed itself for real over the coming years. And whenever we encountered a new and novel irritant on an operation, we would incorporate it into a future training exercise. Subsequent OTC classes caught unmitigated hell because they received the accumulated experience of every operation that preceded their arrival. Finally, just before dawn of the third day, we attacked. At that point, for everyone involved, for the hostages, the hostage takers, and us, it felt real. We were all playing for keeps, and when I went through that emergency exit into the plane, I was shooting to kill. It's just a good thing it was blank fire. The thing that hit me hardest on entering the plane, and the thing I never got used to, though in the future I would be ready for it, was the overwhelming stench. 100 people crammed into a small space for 3 days produce an almost unbearable smell. It hits you like a blow to the face. It's something you have to physically fight your way through when the doors open. The snipers said that as they closed on the plane to help us handle the passengers, they ran into a wall of foul odor pouring from the open doors as much as 50 meters away. One other thing was always the same. Whether it was a training exercise or a real operation, if the ordeal lasted more than 24 hours, the hostages and the hostage takers always reacted the same way. Their sense of reality was restricted to the confines of the plane. The airplane was their planet, in fact, their universe, and everything outside it became alien to them. The group psychology that germinated and took root in that short period of time was always amazing. Outside, the hostage handling was taking place according to plan. After the team leaders inside the plane met and talked out an initial report of actions during the assault, we called to Jim Day that we were ready to turn the scene over to the locals. We went through those formalities and climbed off the plane. We pulled back to the hangar that had been our holding area and stowed our gear. Finally, we were finished. And I, for one, was damned glad of it. I was so tired I was punch drunk. Some guys were almost asleep on their feet, and to a man, we were glassy-eyed and weary. Then Ron called us all together. "We have one thing left to do yet, guys," he told us. "Load all the equipment on the trucks, but keep your pistols and your submachine gun. On the way back, we're going to stop at range 19 and take a shooting test. We have to be there at 0830, so let's get moving. When the equipment is loaded, get on the vans. Team leaders, give me an up when you're ready to move." I noticed 2 cadre members, Bill and Carlos, watching us intently as Ron gave us this last-minute information. But there was no bitching or grousing as we turned to load the equipment onto the trucks, and after seeing no outbursts, the 2 observers went to their own vehicle and departed. Nothing goes unwatched, and no action is too small to go unnoted, I thought, as I watched Bill and Carlos walk away. We were tired, we were hungry, we were sleepy, and we thought we were finished when they hit us with the news of this next test. And taking one of our shooting tests in this condition was going to be a hell of a challenge. But as I thought about it, it made perfect sense. The only thing that had not been tested during the assault on the aircraft was our actual shooting abilities. And when we had finally hit the plane, we were tired, hungry, sleepy, and frustrated, all of which would affect the accuracy of our shooting. It was imperative that the unit know how each man would perform in that condition. Once again, I had to marvel at the thoroughness of our trainers. I slept all the way back to Fort Bragg, but it seemed that the nap only made me groggier. When we climbed out of the vans at range 19, Sergeant Major Shoemate was there to greet us. Okay, ladies, he purred. There's nothing new here this morning. You've all done this shit before. The shooting stations are labeled with their current team designations. Start there and then as individuals, fill in where you see an opening, move along with purpose. I don't want to screw around here all morning. And try not to shoot yourselves. He paused. Unless, of course, it's absolutely necessary. He waved us away with a grin. I felt like I was moving in slow motion and had a hangover to boot as I moved to the first point. I usually breezed through these shooting tests, but now it took all my powers of concentration to focus on the required task at each station. The shooting itself wasn't hard. Instinct seemed to take over and guide me on that part. But I had to think about what I had to do and then tell myself what I had decided. Fatigue is a powerful narcotic, but the shots went where they were supposed to go and within the allowed time limits. I didn't realize I was finished until Donnie took my scorecard and told me to go sit down. Finished. Finally finished. Isn't that something? I cleared my weapons and put them in my bag. It's June now, and I started this ride last September. Not an awfully long time, but a lot has happened since then, and I've changed a good bit. I had found some things inside myself that had never had a chance to show themselves before. I didn't feel different. I felt, well, extended, as if there was now a greater span to my reach. And I felt happy. I had come a long way from the hills of Floyd County, Georgia in the last 10 years.
And that was next to the last segment of Preparing the Force from Inside Delta Force by Eric Haney, Command Sergeant Major, retired. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.